calling the ISI chief to come. Pakistan has all along said these were non-state actors. But I remember our president, then finance minister, then defense minister Pranab Mukherjee standing up in parliament and saying, where do non-state actors come from? They don't come from heaven. And what most Indians will say is, Hafiz Saeed is out there. And he is out there with the benign patronage, or at least at the very least, the looking the other way of the Pakistani state establishment. And Hafiz Saeed was certainly one of the principal architects of the Mumbai attacks. So how can we keep the Pakistani state removed from the accountability for these attacks?
I don't think you can. I mean, I think you, as we say in the book, you need to look back at the genesis of Lashkar-e-Toiba and realise it's a non-state actor, but it is a proxy army. It originally was established as a proxy army of the ISI to fight against Indian forces in Kashmir. So whether or not they can argue that with this particular operation that the ISI as a body did not know what was happening, I think is very difficult to argue that from the Pakistani side. And also, if you look at the level of how much David Headley, the main asset, was reporting back to a senior Pakistani officer, a senior ISI officer, this Major Iqbal, who also has never been positively identified. He, like his contemporaries over here, would never do anything without his senior officers authorising. So the idea that he is a lone agent in Lahore, running this crazy American-Pakistani guy who's coming back and forth, putting together this plan to attack Mumbai, without his senior officers knowing is just impossible, it's unrealistic.
I asked a really stupid question of a really wonderful veteran investigator, civilian investigator in the FIA. And I said to him, come on, just be frank with me. Let's have the Lashkar-e-Toiba talk. Because we've done Al-Qaeda, we've done Lashkar-e-Jangvi, we've done Sipa al-Sahaba, we've done TTP together. And he knew more than anyone in the world about nearly all of those organisations. And I could spend 3-4 weeks just listening to this remarkable encyclopedia. And he said to me, I don't know anything about Lashkar-e-Toiba. And I said, just explain that to me. And then I realised what a stupid question it was. Because all of the other groups were outlaw groups that had attacked the state, and Lashkar-e-Toiba, the Army of the Pure,
was a strategic
was
asset.
the state. And the result of that, which I'd never really taken in until this very conversation, was that every time they investigate Lashkar-e-Jangvi and they investigate the Masood family and clan for TTP, they are actively not investigating Lashkar-e-Toiba, because to do so could well result in their own deaths, could well result in their own, the end of their careers, the finishing of their lives and their families' lives, because such is the fear that surrounds the organisation. And when you understand that, it's the same relationship between Sinn Féin and IRA. And Hafiz Saeed is Jerry Adams.
And having created, like the parallel from Ireland, having created the Lashkar and allowed it to become so powerful, there is now fear in taking it on. Or maybe an unwillingness even, which is how it seems to us sitting here, that, I mean, this is in the heart of the Punjab in Pakistan. Surely you could shut it down if you wanted to. The funding of the Jamaat-ud-Dawa is another big question.
Well, Jamaat-ud-Dawa is now such an important political force, and the amount of money and the landowning support for Jamaat-ud-Dawa and Hafiz Saeed means that he will never be shut down. His organisation will never be shut down. It's not in anyone's interest in Pakistan to shut down that organisation. And I think in terms of their commitment to investigating 2611, all you need to look to is what's happened to Zakir Rehman Lakvi, who remains in Adiala prison in Islamabad with his cell phone, with his conjugal rights, a young daughter, as was revealed by Abu Jundal when he was interrogated when he was brought back here. I mean, he is still running Lashkar-e-Toiba from within the prison walls. Hafiz Saeed is still traipsing around, well, going around the countryside in his 4x4 with his Defence for Pakistan conferences and holding public rallies. I mean, we went to see him. He's very accessible. But he's never picked up a weapon. You can't, on paper, connect him specifically to Mumbai or to Lashkar-e-Toiba. He's very careful to keep those things separate.
Pakistan fear, and the fear within the army, as they tell us repeatedly, is of the sectarian groups they can't control. The people they fear are TTP. They fear the fact that TTP is now an amalgam of the sectarian groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and those groups are now repeatedly attacking the Pakistani military, as they have been from Musharraf onwards. And they are the absolute nemesis of the country. But you will never get them to focus on Lashkar-e-Toiba.
One other thing to say, I was speaking to a general this week who's a very close friend of the new army chief in Pakistan, General Sharif. And I asked him about Mumbai and whether or not investigations, the Pakistan side of the investigations and bringing people to justice would speed up at all at any stage. And he said the one thing you've got to remember is that India is the most contentious issue for us. We view Kashmir, Siachen, water as the three most contentious issues for any dialogue with India. We don't see India as having any interest in pursuing a dialogue with us. And in fact, that he criticised India on behalf of General Sharif for constantly bringing up Mumbai as an issue to cloud the main issue, which was that you needed to have discussions.
To which most Indians would say it's possibly easier to reach a resolution on Kashmir today with Pakistan than it is to actually get past terrorism, which is now opened in other fronts like Mumbai. I remember when I was flying to Mumbai to cover these attacks, there was somebody I knew quite well from the Kashmir Valley, and he just turned around and said, well, Srinagar is safer today than Mumbai, because even something like this we haven't seen in the valley. I just want to ask a last question before we open up for questions from the audience, because I think we have about 10 minutes left, Adrian, and that would be, is there an understanding in Pakistan that if there were to be another 26/11, firstly, could there be another 26/11? Because the way this was planned, it's not even so massively sophisticated, it wasn't massively expensive. So could there be another 26/11? And is there an understanding in Pakistan that while India's response was extremely restrained when it happened, no government could afford to have a similarly restrained response the next time around?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there has been a kind of another 26/11 in the sense that the Westgate Mall attack in Nairobi was carried out by people trained in the same camps as the 26/11 Fedayeen squad. And the mastermind of the operation in Westgate had been in Muzaffarabad. And,
being trained by Lashkar-e-Toiba.
There is a genesis, there's a straight line. And if you want to talk about lessons learned, there was a lesson learned there, which was that the police and security forces shut down TV, shut down telephone, created a vacuum, and of course we have yet to find out actually what went on inside. It's very murky. But so in that sense, what you're going to see, as David Culcullen and lots of other people are telling us all the time, is the Mujahid moved out of the mountains. That's his line on his speaking tour. But actually, since Tora Bora, they've moved out of the mountains. The wide open city is the target. The civilian centres are the target. Converts are the clean skins going in to do the job of the ideologues. And in nearly all cases, they're not particularly political. They're not particularly religious. They're from dysfunctional families and manipulated by these outfits to carry out these operations. So 26/11 is happening and being reinvented all the time.
But I also think it could happen again here, because one thing I didn't say before about Lashkar and why the Pakistani authorities don't clamp down on them is that until they view Kashmir as the biggest issue for them, and because Lashkar is their proxy army in Kashmir, they are not going to disband that army, because the fight for Kashmir is not over as far as they're concerned, and won't be until you discuss with them. So I think Lashkar will still be out there and will still be empowered and will still be able to carry on with its plans and its plotting for many years to come.
But is there an understanding that India would not be able to afford to respond in the sort of muted manner that we did? I mean, I say muted, some would say responsible, you can say restrained. But were this to happen again, whatever be your adjective of choice, public opinion would just not permit it. The sentiments of people would just not permit that kind of restraint. So I'm just wondering if that is processed into the calculations of...
Yes, mutually assured destruction. You know, we're back on MAD, aren't we?
But I don't think the process actually does, the long-term thinking does actually happen, because I think people get very heated and they decide to do an operation or to launch something to resolve one specific problem. They don't think about the consequences 3 stages down the line.
That's exactly right. I mean, you know, the most interesting thing, Hafiz Saeed was confronted by a younger faction within Lashkar-e-Toiba that said to him in 2007, the outfit is finished, because we are now completely fed up with being an affiliate of a military that has raided a mosque, which was Lal Masjid. So the organisation was losing money, it had hemorrhaged members, and its key military commanders now idealised Ilyas Kashmiri and had fled the Lashkar nest. And they needed a spectacular, a shop window, in the most selfish, vain, bizarre, surreal kind of way, to staple back together a fractious organisation that was facing its own downfall.
And also, if you think at what state Pakistan was in at that stage, there were bombs going off in the capital all the time, suicide blasts, people being killed, left, right and centre. The tribal areas and SWAT were all out of control or under TTP control. The former Prime Minister was assassinated. They wanted to shift some of that onto India rather than being seen around the world as the world's messiest country.
Well, I think some chilling revelations and thoughts, and really a pressing argument for a serious commission of inquiry. It smacks of a cover-up in a sense to not have one. I think we have about a few minutes for a few questions. If people have them, please raise your hand. I'm looking at my watch. I'll try and accommodate as many as I can. Please raise your hand. I will call out the question, and then if we can get a mic to the young lady here in the first row, please. Yeah, right here. Didn't you raise your hand in the pink T-shirt? No? Okay. Let's move it along. Yes, go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, this is a question for Adrian and Kathy. To pick up on the last point that you made about Westgate, and also the larger point about 2611, how equipped is India and how differently would Mumbai or any other city react to an attack like this? And of course, the second question I want to ask you was from the perspective of someone who survived the attack, and we exchanged emails about this. As part of the post-mortem of what happened on that night, nobody had actually touched upon the fact that the government has no template or no concern for what happens to people who survive these attacks or victims or families of these survivors. I've exchanged with you an email what was done to me and my mother after we were brought out half an hour from the Taj. And we were just put in a police station and told to find a taxi to go home.
Yeah.
There has been no accountability. The Taj contacted me twice to help me psychologically. The police or the government is not contacting me. They don't really care about my existence after having me brought me out.
Before Adrian answers that, I think you put that question once to the Home Minister as well, if I remember correctly, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And of course, he had a very, very wide and condescending way of reacting to that, asking me for suggestions. That was just shocking.
One thing I'd like to say on the second point you're making, which is that there's no support for victims or survivors, is that, again, I think a commission along the lines of like the 7/7 inquiry in the UK would be the way forward, where everyone gets an opportunity to voice their opinion, their experiences. I mean, in London it went from people who were stuck inside the train carriages to the wives of the bombers to the head of the intelligence services, until you have that equivalent of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an open airing of everybody's grievances and concerns. I don't think this could ever be put to bed as an issue.
Next question, please. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Imran Merchant. I'm based in Bombay, a freelance writer and journalist. Very, very quickly, I want to amplify this just a bit by raising 2 or 3 extra dots in the conversation and then asking you, all 3 of you, to react to that. Now, the danger of some more attacks happening is very real. It can happen anytime. The reasons are, for example, today is the 6th of December, a very important anniversary in India, where a certain mosque was brought down some years ago in Ayodhya. This has led to millions of Muslims in India being very unhappy and dissatisfied. That's the first point. The second and third points, which you kept referring to, Kashmir is still a very fresh, open wound for Pakistanis, whether we in India like it or not. It's for them a very open issue. It's a historical mistake. The third point is, millions of Pakistanis do not forgive Indians for what Indira Gandhi did. In the case of the Bangladeshi war, they created another country out of East Pakistan. These sort of situations which are happening is making me ask my question. The question is, let's just talk in terms of a particular attack that happened in Bombay. Let us try to be honest today and ask, what are some of the root causes that are festering between the two neighboring countries which are leading to such attacks? Thank you.
Adrian, either of you want to take that? If I could add a question, this is always a problematic formulation because there are those who say get to the root and there are others who say no matter what problems are, you can never use terrorism as a template to address those problems. And I think that's where the Indian response comes from, that if there are issues in Kashmir, there's a dialogue table for it and that dialogue is taking place.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an issue, part of the paralysis that people point to in the government, whether that be economic, defense, or even in electioneering, also extends, as you yourself know, to the Kashmir issue. I mean, we both followed in detail, you here, us over there, the issue of mass graves, and the fact that the mediators emerged and vanished as quickly. There's just this lack of momentum or lack of dedication to seeing through the missions as declared by government itself, which is an issue, and it is an issue that is being picked upon continually. And if you go now to Tral in Kashmir and look at the number of new recruits who are going over to HM and who are making LET resurgent again, and you listen to the people who say that Kunam Pushpora has not been resolved and the army has now just stepped back and refused to take responsibility, that would be the only mass rape not reported in India. After all of the diatribes.
And while what you're saying has to be acknowledged, let me ask a counter question. And the counter question would be, given the deep roots of radicalism in Pakistan, would even a resolution of the Kashmir issue between India and Pakistan change anything in terms of vulnerability to attacks like 2611? And I ask this especially because we do now know, with a certain degree of accuracy, even though there are official denials from Pakistan, that there was a broad plan, whether it was started with Musharraf and his 4-point formula, there was a willingness to look at some of this as a template for a solution, soft borders, greater autonomy on both sides, a better human rights record. There is still a possible template for a solution for Kashmir. I'm just not convinced anymore that it would put a lid on the 2611 kind of attacks, given the internal condition of Pakistan.
Well, I'd like to just say something about that. I think you can't see Pakistan as a country as a whole. I think it depends on where you're talking about. I think with Lashkar-e-Toiba in the Punjab, an effort to resolve the issue of Kashmir would make a huge difference. I think that the likes of the TTP, Malala Fazlullah and the people who are now in the tribal areas, they're a completely different issue. They're not fighting for causes or for Kashmir, or they're fighting for the sake of fighting. And also I do think on the issue of Kashmir, because as the new army chief has said this week, India is the main area of concern and Kashmir is the most contentious issue. And of course his older brother died in the 1970 war in Bangladesh. There's so much history in that new appointment that unless the two countries address those fundamental issues and sit down and discuss together, I don't think you can ever go forward.
But isn't it chicken and egg? Because the fact is that you have something like Mumbai happen and there can be no talks. And no government would be able to proceed with dialogue in the backdrop of recurring terror attacks.
Yes, I mean, it's the situation, it's the continuous instability that prevents the talks happening. Every time the hand is offered, the hand is bitten, which increases the power of the hawks. And there's a societal issue that Pakistan is debating, which is that when you travel through the southern and eastern Punjab, the government disappears. And what replaces the government is the jihad factory. And so who gives the medical aid? Who brings the social services? Who provides the education? Who does disaster relief during the floods and earthquakes?
But that is the jihad factory for Kashmir. It's not the same jihad factory in the northwest. They're separate. They're not the same. They're not part. And there might be some crossover, but they're not the same organisations, and they don't have the same goals.
Okay, let's take the next question. We have just about 5-7 minutes left. So at the back, please, the gentleman at the back. Yeah, there. If you could just stand, we'll get you a mic. Yeah.
My name is Dr. Nitin Parab, and as research scholars, as you have seen in depth the magnitude of how a demented mind can work on the human race, is fear the only key that they want to wage amongst the human race, or are they driven by some other missionary or ideologies that drive them to do such act? What is your take on this? How are you looking at the human mind operating against the human race?
If you're talking about the boys on the ground, the attackers who went into the hotel and the other targets, I think it was a combination of fear and ignorance, and also a need to create something in their lives. I mean, they came from nothing. They came from villages where the most they could hope for would be to earn 200 rupees a week working in their father's field. If someone comes into a village with a pickup and brandishing a load of Kalashnikovs and says, "Do you want to come with me?" then there are plenty more boys in that area who will do the same, because it represents an opportunity that is not there. By the time they got to Mumbai, I'm very sure that they were absolutely terrified. But they know that there are the handlers back in Karachi who are watching every move, and they're on the phone and they're on the satellite phone. And if they don't perform according to the instructions they've been given, then they're going to get that phone call 5 minutes later. So yes, it was total fear that was pursuing them, pushing them forwards at the beginning of the attack.
But what is the political goal of 2611? I mean, it's a good question, isn't it? Because fear, I think the notion of fear and insecurity and setting ourselves against ourselves is part of that goal. Dividing communities, creating sectarianism, and then the response will be sectarian. I think they're engendering a greater divide. It happened in London terribly after 7/7, when you saw Sikhs getting attacked because they were mistaken for Muslims. There's this huge fissure that's created after a tumultuous event, and I think that is